Overwatering. It's probably the most common mistake us plant parents make around the world. And the advice we always hear is just don't water too often. Simples, right? Here's the thing. Watering frequency is only part of the solution, because if that was all there was to it, no one would actually struggle with overwatering, would they? The real problem is actually something else, and once I figured that out, I never ever had to stress about overwatering again. Most people think overwatering just means watering too often. But the reality is overwatering happens when roots suffocate because there's no oxygen in the soil.
Watering is important, but making sure you get air into that soil, helping those roots to breathe between waterings, is just as important, if not more so.
That's why, if you think about it, two people can water their plants on the exact same schedule.
With the exact same amount of water,
one plant thrives and the other one
struggles.
That's because one has well-draining soil that allows oxygen to get to the roots, while the other is sitting in compacted soil that just holds too much water and isn't helping the plant. Think of it like this. Imagine your soil is like a sponge. When you water it, it absorbs the moisture while still holding up air. But if that sponge is completely soaked, there's no room left for the air. It's just waterlogged. And that's exactly what happens in compacted, soggy soil. Plant roots need oxygen to function, just like we humans need air to breathe. So you want that soil to get fully hydrated, but any excess water must drain out. Because the real problem isn't the water itself, it's when water fills up all those air pockets in the soil where the oxygen should be. So if the soil stays wet for too long, those air pockets disappear, and that's when the roots suffocate. That's when overwatering becomes an issue. So, when it comes to this overwatering problem, instead of asking how often you should water, the better question is, how fast does my soil dry out between waterings? That's what actually determines what time it is or when it is to water again. Okay, but wait, you're probably saying to yourself, Angie, if overwatering is just all about the lack of air, then how come some plants can grow in water just fine?
Well, here's the key difference.
When a plant is grown hydroponically in just water,
the roots adapt by growing what's called water roots, which are designed to pull oxygen directly from the water itself. That works because water contains dissolved oxygen. It's H2O. I mean, it literally has oxygen built into it. But when a plant is in soil, the roots rely on air pockets in the soil to breathe. But if that soil is too thick or too dense or stays wet for too long, just like with the sponge example, those air pockets disappear and the roots suffocate.
And that's where rot starts in. Think about it.
If you put your hand in a glass of water, it moves freely. But if you stick your hand in thick, muddy, sludgy soil, it's trapped. The same thing happens to plant roots in compacted, soggy soil. There's no way for the oxygen to reach them properly. That's why chunky, well-draining soil is one of the big secrets to avoid overwatering. It holds moisture, but also creates air pockets so the roots can breathe. So the frequency of watering isn't the trick, it's the amount of oxygen getting to the roots that makes your plant really thrive.
That's the key. I stopped overwatering once I realised the problem wasn't just how often I was watering, but how my soil handled that water. It was a game changer for me. So what if you realise you've already overwatered? Not the nicest place to be, but don't panic, don't worry too much. There are a few things you can do to help your plant recover depending on how far your plant has gone or perhaps rotted. If it's not too far, the first thing I want you to do is just immediately stop watering and check the drainage of the plant. Check there's holes in the pot first, that's very important. And no matter whether it's wilted or not, no matter what it looks like, just stop watering the plant. If there's water sitting in the saucer, dump it out, nice and simple. Next, I want you to check and aerate the soil. If you've got one spare, you can use a chopstick or a skewer or something to poke a few holes in to help the air circulate. And when you put the chopstick in, don't just pop it in and out, wriggle it around, really try and make sure that soil is just a little bit looser. And if the soil is still really wet and it remains staying wet for too long, you might need to repot it into fresh, well-draining soil. So if that's the case, I want you to gently slide the plant out of its pot and check the roots. You want to see if you've still got nice, healthy, chunky, white or hard, firm roots. if they're mushy or brown or bendable, or if you can pull the skin off and you're just left with this little piece of string that's the roots, that's not a good place to be. If you've got that, I want you to trim off all the rotten parts of the roots, get rid of them with some clean scissors, some sterilized scissors, just spray some isopropyl alcohol onto the scissors and cut away. And cut all of the bad part off. Don't just cut the end, cut into the healthy root just a little bit so you can get rid of all the bad stuff. So get rid of all the roots, and then if you're going to pop it back into some soil, make sure that soil is a really aerated soil, and I'll talk about that in a second. I know how frustrating it can be to just wonder if you're watering too much, if you're watering too little, or if you're just completely getting it wrong and think you're getting it wrong. And I don't want you to second guess yourself every time you're picking up a watering can. So I've put together this very simple no more overwatering cheat sheet or guide, whatever you want to call it. It's just a simple go-to guide that makes it easy for you to recognize overwatering, quickly identify some of the signs of overwatering, and give you some easy tips to just fix it so it won't happen again. Put it up in your shed next to your garden accessories, whatever you need to do. Grab the guide. It's free in the description down below. It's all yours to keep before we go into the detail, just so you don't have to scribble all this stuff down. Now that we've checked that we can recover the plant, if it's too far gone and if the stem is really mushy and soft, unfortunately that plant might be too far gone. You can definitely still try to save it based on what I've just said. See how you go. But sometimes overwatering is really hard to come back from. And if that's the case, just put the plant in the compost bin and start again. Don't beat yourself up on it. Happens to everybody. So let's talk about some classic signs of overwatering, because a lot of us misdiagnose plants and end up sometimes making things a bit worse. You might look at a plant and you're thinking, oh, it's so droopy and so sad, it must be overwatered. Or you might even think it must be underwatered. But is that really the problem? How do you tell? So the first thing you need to look out for, if your plant looks limp and droopy, don't just assume, please, don't just assume that it needs water. That's a big thing that I think many of us starting out think straight away. If it's droopy, it needs water. You need to check the soil first.
If the soil is damp,
and if the stems feel mushy and soft, just like the roots might have been, or the leaves are yellowing and falling off, especially from the base, that's a strong sign of overwatering. Another big clue is use your nose and smell the soil. So don't just look at the soil, smell the soil. So if it has like a damp, musty, or slightly rotten smell, you know when you walk into a room and there's no airflow, it's been closed for like a couple of weeks on holiday, and you walk into it and it's like this stagnant, musty smell, that's the kind of thing you're almost looking at from your soil. If it smells like a fresh garden, it's great. If it smells like some kind of weird, musty, rotten smell, you probably have too much moisture and not enough air circulation around those roots. And check the bottom of the pot. If there's water in the saucer, especially if that water isn't disappearing after about 3 days or so, your soil still might be holding on to too much moisture, and that's not a good sign either. And if that soil of yours that's holding your plant, if that hasn't dried out in about 5 to 7 days, if it hasn't dried out in 7 days, that's a really red flag for me. Even accounting for the different plant types and the different seasons, it still should have dried out somewhat in 7 days or so. So if it hasn't, it means either your plant isn't absorbing the water properly, or the soil type is too thick, or a bit of both. But as many of us know, and here's the tricky part, sometimes plants show similar symptoms when overwatering isn't actually the real issue. For example, if your plant leaves are wrinkled and crispy, that's actually a sign of underwatering sometimes. Or you could have a pot that is root bound, which means that there's too many roots and not enough soil to hold any moisture. Or another sign of underwatering is the soil could be hydrophobic, which means that it feels like a bit of a hard, sandy kind of rock and you can't really move it and no water goes in. So overwatering a wilted plant can make things worse, and coming back from overwatering is a lot harder than coming back from underwatering. So before you assume you're overwatering, just take a minute to check these signs and make sure you're fixing the right problem with the right solution. If you're not sure, err on the side of caution, don't water it, leave it another day or two, come back and check if it needs water again. Okay, so how do we stop our overwatering for good? So once I made these changes, I never honestly really had to stress about overwatering again. So first, I've talked about the soil. So if your soil is too dense and compacted, it's just holding onto too much water and it suffocates the roots. So to fix that, grab a chunky, well-draining mix. Or if you've just got potting mix, you want to add something to it to make it chunky. So stuff like orchid bark or perlite or pumice or husky cocoa chunks, stuff like that, putting it into the soil makes it much more aerated. So not only will the soil hold moisture, you'll also get air and oxygen flow to the roots as well. You'll get a bit of both, which is exactly what you want. So all of that stuff just allows the excess water to drain out, also while keeping the roots hydrated. It's the balance of water and air. Think of it just like giving your plants nice, breathable, good quality sneakers as opposed to soaking wet socks. Have you ever tried putting on soaking wet socks? It's disgusting. Anyway, you get my point. Okay, next thing I want you to do is I want you to make sure that you're adjusting how you water throughout the year. In warmer months, plants drink up water faster, just like us humans. So you'll just naturally need to water them more often. But in winter, growth slows down. They need far less water, and obviously you just don't water them as often. If you have a set watering schedule that doesn't change as the seasons change, that watering schedule just won't work. So instead of going by a schedule, start learning to read your plant and the soil conditions and make sure you know when it's time to water, when that soil is starting to dry out. Another thing, don't just rely on the finger test. I know many YouTubers and social media people say, test the soil with your finger. And that works okay if you've got a really small plant and a really small pot. But the problem is the top of the soil in a plant pot always dries out a lot quicker, but the roots could still be sitting in a lot of moisture. So instead, maybe try lifting the pot. If the pot feels really light, it's easy to pick up, it obviously needs a water. If it still feels heavy, or you're not quite sure, there's probably still moisture in that potting mix and you probably don't need to water. You can also use a wooden chopstick or a skewer, put the chopstick into the soil, make sure you're getting right down to that bottom of that pot. If it comes out damp or if there's still like soil mix onto the skewer, it's holding onto water, it probably doesn't need a watering. If it's dry and it feels like sandy on that skewer, you're good to go, give it a water, go for it. And I'm also going to share with you one of my favorite hacks that I do for almost every plant. If you use a decorative outer pot, put a layer of some kind of rocky thing between the plastic inner pot with the plant and the outer decorative pot. So think of pumice, rocks, perlite, even something like the Chusapon, something that will help keep the airflow between the plastic inner pot and the outer decorative pot. That way, if extra water collects, goes through the plant, it won't collect and sit in the bottom of the plastic pot in the soil. It'll flow through all of those drainage holes and it'll sit in that rock layer or that pumice layer that you've created. And that will give your plant airflow still. So instead of getting root rot. So for me, it's just like a little bit of extra safety net for my plants. It's not sitting in the plastic pot, it's sitting in the layer. And I do still check, obviously, if there's too much water in that layer, but at least I know if I don't have time to check, there's a bit of a safety net there. Do me a favor though, don't put that layer in the plastic pot. Just keep that for the soil and the aeration and the growth and make sure those roots have a lot of room to move around. Put it between the plastic pot and the outer pot. Seriously, when I made all of these small little changes, it just made a huge difference to my plants. And once I started applying them, I stopped overwatering and I really just kind of stopped worrying about overwatering completely. What I worry about the most is the right soil mix for my plants. Now, if you want to make sure that you're never overwatering again, I mentioned it before, grab my no more overwatering cheat sheet. It's a long name, but you get the point. It's in the description below. The link is there. It's free for you. Grab it, put it up somewhere. It's yours to keep forever and ever. Now, as you may have noticed, I've talked about soil quite a bit in this video. So if you're still wondering what soil mix actually works to prevent overwatering, you're going to love my next video. I'm having a lot of fun doing it right now. I have tried every plant YouTuber's advice out there. I've gone to all of the big ones out there and they all talk a few different elements. And then I've created my own mix from all of that advice out there. So I'm going to show you the arid mix that I use. I'll break it down exactly how this mix works, why this mix works, and how you can make it yourself for the future. I want you to check it out. I'm going to leave the link for you to go to this video next. So thank you very much for watching. Until next time, have a great week full of leaves, love and laughter as always. I'll see you in this video here.